As many of you know, in a few weeks, I will be embarking on my summer leave, following the academic calendar like professors and teachers. Life here will continue on with great services and music and children's programs. But every year's end leads me to reflect on how things are going and where things are going. And especially this year, the end of the 2018-2019 congregational year. It's especially meaningful for me. It marks 3 years here at Fourth Universalist. Now, 3 years might seem like an arbitrary number, on the surface hardly different than 2 or 4 or 5. But for me and many ministers, 3 is a significant number. That's in part because 3 years is the minimum number of years you can serve a congregation before you can think about moving on. The first 3 years, you are essentially locked in, unless you want a bad mark on your record and leave early. After 3 years, though, a minister gets to choose. The feeling of staying in one place is unusual for me. Ever since I was in college and graduated 12 years ago, I've never stayed anywhere longer than 3 years. Depending on how you count, I have served between 3 and 7 congregations, and each time I became experienced in leaving. In one case, the congregation was running a massive deficit, and I left after 1 year. Another, I left after 2 to go to grad school. And most recently, despite serving a wonderful congregation in Wisconsin, it was hard for me to say no to an offer from a cool, hip church in the big city. In many ways, I found it easier to leave a place than to stay. It's easier to make a nice first impression, leave people with positive memories, and then head off into the sunset before the honeymoon wears off. It's safer because you don't have to be there when the energy runs out, if the growth stalls, if things don't always stay rosy. I've told some of you I worry someday about simply running out of things to say. We've heard that story before, one of you will tell me someday. I've seen and heard of ministers who stay way too long, where people have given their gifts, where they continue on like an ambivalent marriage with their congregation, just going through the motions after too long. Now, I'm sure that's not what you want in a minister at your congregation, and it's not what I want for the kind of life that I want to lead. There is a risk in commitment to one another. Risk that what is good becomes sour, that with time love does not grow fonder. Certainly longtime members of this congregation can know a little bit what that feels like, especially in terms of clergy. A good start and a painful ending. It happened with my predecessor and her predecessor and his and hers and his, all the way back. When I first began at Fourth Universalist 3 years ago, I knew that history. Of course, I didn't feel great about it. That's a hard trend to break. I was not foolish enough to think that it would not affect me in some way, but I was hopeful that we could create a new pattern together. When I looked at where I wanted to end up, Fourth Universalist stood out as unique for a lot of good reasons. It had this unsettling history going back decades and decades and decades, but it also had wonderful, encouraging, and hopeful things. A thriving young adult ministry that was not just relegated to a group, but actively involved in the leadership of the congregation. A history of progressive activism that was radical and unapologetic. A building that, once restored, could support big dreams. The past 3 years have been an exploration of these virtues while riding the waves the world has thrown at us. Year 1 was all about responding to the election of 2016 and wrestling with the aftermath of swastikas and hate speeches being carved on our front doors. Year 2 was about us living into our commitment to sanctuary, to being a place to protect undocumented immigrants. Year 3, the end of this year, was about fulfilling that sanctuary commitment and also embarking on the campaign to save our sanctuary this building from decay. Looking back, there has rarely been a dull moment. That can be a good thing or not a good thing, depending on how you look at it. There's always something happening and always a surprise. Just opening my inbox each and every day can be a practice in never knowing what's around the corner. Sometimes there's an inspiring and reassuring message from someone I've never met or just barely met, who's been attending services and been moved, profoundly shaped by something going on here. Sometimes it's an email invitation inviting me to appear in a reality show about drag queens finding their spiritual home. Other times it's about the thrill of getting an email from a researcher who tells you some history about this special place that you never knew, like both Oscar Hammerstein and Barbara Giddings went to this congregation and were profoundly shaped by it, which I had never heard before this year. Here at Fourth Universalist, these surprises are a good kind of unpredictable. They are paired with feelings of progress, of moving forward, of unlocking achievements. Whether it's getting a slate roof over the summer, expanding our adult education programs, getting a new website, or meeting with enthusiastic lay folks like all of you about some new idea for a group, I love the feeling that we are building something together. This is part of the perfectionist in me. There wasn't work to be done. What would I be doing? It feels good to accomplish things, to feel like one's actions are making a difference. That's one of the gifts of serving a congregation like Fourth Universalist. It's a gift given to me each and every day, and I think it's one that we each get to buy into as well. But of course, it's not always a good thing when progress is so easy to achieve and visualize. It can show that things haven't always gone so well, and that is certainly true here too. I've served congregations that have been humming along smoothly for decades, with only the occasional deviation or bump in the road. My last congregation, for example, I had no idea how coffee hour, the time after service where we have coffee and tea and snacks, I had no idea how they organized it. I was there for 2 years. I assume someone organized it, got volunteers, bought supplies, figured it out somehow. But here, I know how it's done. I get informed almost weekly on the updates, on the struggles and tribulations of the hospitality team. They know it can be a slog for volunteers just to convince people to sign up, let alone work to make it an essential part of our ministry here. Coffee hour for me is emblematic of one of the unique and interesting challenges that Fourth Universalist faces. I've never seen it anywhere else in the 3 to 7 congregations that I have served before, but it has been a defining part of my time here and learning and growth for me. I think it boils down to this fact that community building is especially hard to do. I'm not sure if this is a New York City thing, or an Upper West Side thing, or even just a plain old Fourth Universalist thing. And it's not a recent phenomenon. It's one that we've all inherited in some form. There's an old story that some of you have heard me tell from the 1920s that's recounted by the minister of the time named Charles Francis Potter. He had written an autobiography later in his life and had a chapter called Ministry in New York City. He only lasted 2 years after being unceremoniously thrown out of the congregation for being too humanist at the time in a largely Christian congregation. In his memoirs, reflecting on this short period of his life, he tells of a moment that happened right outside of our church, where a car, probably one of the very first cars in the 1920s, ran into the Central Park West wall by the park. You can imagine a crowd formed around to see this, the smoke coming up, to see if everyone was okay. And in that crowd, there was a man who turned to someone next to him and said, "Can you believe that such a horrible thing would happen right across from this church? I love this church. I'm a member there. I'm actually on the board, and I can't believe that something like this would happen so close to my spiritual home. And the man that he's talking to right next to him says, yeah, I am in complete agreement, and I'm shocked and surprised because I too am a member of the board. And I've never met you before. So even 100 years ago, it was hard for Fourth Universalists to build community. And it continues today. One of my favorite things these past 3 years has been the last year, where I've been able to sit down with many of you to talk about the Capitol campaign. Now, obviously, it was important for many reasons to help support our building, to make sure that our congregation has a future. But one of the things I loved about it most of all was beyond witnessing your incredible generosity, which blew me away and blew so many of our leaders away, was it just the chance to sit down with you and talk to you about your lives, what was going well, where your disappointments were, where you came from, and where you hope to go. That's part of why I got into ministry in the first place, were those kind of conversations. And one of the things that came through accidentally when I met with you over dinner or lunch or in your home was something that surprised me, but made sense when I got to thinking about it. I started asking who you knew in the congregation, who are your friends in the congregation? And what stood out to me again and again was that so many of us had church friends or people we liked in the church, but they weren't friends we ever saw outside of this congregation. Very few people had moved from people we see and liked on Sunday morning to people we hung out with afterwards. I shouldn't have been surprised given our history, but this, in all the congregations I've served, is really unusual. In almost all the places I've been, congregations are a center of friendship and community that radiates outwards into the rest of the week and the months and the years of people's lives. Sunday mornings might be a hub of friendship, but there are spokes and tires that happen all over the place. I think New York City is in part to blame, and I certainly don't mean to imply that anyone here is to blame. This is a hard place to live. Many of us are so busy and stressed all the time that it's hard to build community and make friends that go deep. Our attention is divided, and we are pulled in so many different directions. We exist together in a hyper-competitive environment that rewards overwork as almost a spiritual virtue. We brag about being busy. It's kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card. And even just leaving home and going anywhere is an emotional ordeal. The subway for me sometimes feels like a giant energy vampire. It just sucks the energy that I have out away from anything else. Back in my high school chemistry class, which I was not very good at, we learned about a phenomenon called activation energy, which is essentially that the amount of energy needed to start something depended upon the certain mix of chemicals and molecules. Some things had very low activation energy, things you didn't have to try very hard to do, but some things had very high. And I think here in New York City, we have a very high activation energy, and that is part of why it's hard to build relationships and community and friendships. There's another factor that I've learned that makes this hard at Fourth Universalist. In all the other congregations that I've served, the congregation's membership is stable. Sometimes it grows and sometimes it shrinks, but mostly the people there are settled. It's like a village. People sometimes move in and they sometimes move out, but mostly they are from there, they live there, they plan to stay there, and they have and want to put deep roots down. And so there is relative stability and community over the years. It leads to deep relationships and a strong sense of congregational identity and a clear vision of community. But Fourth Universalist, it's not a village. We certainly do have folks who have been here for many, many years. But a lot of us don't know what the future holds for us. Many of us are from other places and ended up in New York for school or jobs or family for who knows how long time. We know the burden of high rents and small apartments. Our congregation, growing as it is, sees tremendous turnover because people simply leave the city. We are not a village. We are more a port or a harbor, a place where people come from for a time, seeking peace, sanctuary, hope, some grounding in connection, but never knowing when the ship might sail away. This struck home especially to me this past spring when we had our annual young adult service, which is one of my favorite services all year. It's when our 20s and 30-somethings in our congregation come together to share their experience of life, their spiritual insight for the rest of us here. And it brought me back to when I was interviewing all of 3 years ago, when I sat down for lunch with the then young adult group. There was 15 to 20 people at that lunch. And the group that led service this spring was an entirely different group. None of the young adults who was at that lunch 3 years ago helped with that service. Part of it is that folks aged out. As someone about to reach middle adulthood, that happens. Part of it is that people leave, and they move, and they transition. So the challenge for us is, how do we build connection in this place, in a place with such transition and movement, with high activation energy in a city that is stressful? How do we try to put down roots, give our hearts fully to something when we don't know what the future holds? Or if we are someone who is here for the long run, how do we embrace the person next to us who might not be? How do we not forget to serve the people who may just be here for a month, but for who that month can be life-changing, a harbor in the storm, and not forget that their life and their experience and their time with us is just as important as anyone else's? There aren't any easy solutions to these questions because the questions are hard. What I do know is that despite these struggles that our congregation faces, that a lot of us as people face, these questions affirm the very reasons why communities like Fourth Universalist need to exist, no matter how long people stay within them. Many of us feel so disconnected and isolated, and our lives feel so disoriented and disjointed. We come here to make it feel a little bit better. The solutions don't have to be mysterious for us. Small steps can go a long way. It's maybe as simple as inviting one of your church friends over this summer to do something that has nothing to do with church. Think about who that person or family might be. Think about what you might like doing together. Maybe it's dinner, a movie, free theater in the park, a drink at your local watering hole. Or the next time you see an advertisement for the retreat here at Fourth U, or game night, which was a blast on Friday night if you missed it, which I can say even after I was destroyed 10-1 in euchre. Thanks, Ed. Whatever it is that requires that extra step to make you feel like you are less alone, that this community holds you in and is a place that feels rooted for you. Because even though we might not feel like we have the time, we might not feel like we have the energy, we need roots. It's hard to get through life without them. And this is a place that can do that if we invest in it. Fourth Universalist, for me, despite all of these unique challenges, has become a home over the last 3 years. A place that for me has been for stability and love, a grounding place as life and the world changes unpredictably around me. We will never know what the future holds, and I don't plan on going anywhere anytime soon. But there is comfort and hope that comes from claiming a place and the people as my own. It feels like these past 3 years have gone by incredibly fast. It feels like I just got here. I'm not sure when I'll stop being the new minister, but I suspect that time is coming soon. What I do know is that I am happy to be here, to be with you in this wonderful work that at its foundation is the work of binding us together, which is the root of what the word religion means at its core, to bind closely. That brings us, filling us with joy and hope and love. This work is the work of building a home, together with all of you. May it continue to be so, and amen.